Hello and welcome to Woodwell and Anderson. This is a channel where we talk about economic, financial, and we talk about some business things in simple terms. We're on the series of gentrification, and we're going to be talking about the history of the gentrification of Atlanta, Georgia. Now, it's important you know the history of the gentrification of Atlanta, so when you go and see the videos on what happened, you can understand how it happened. Let me start at the beginning. What is gentrification? Gentrification is replacement of one class of people by another class of people. The term comes from a lady named Ruth Glass in England in 1964, where she created the term. She was hired to do a survey, and the term gentrification came from that. The word gentry itself is an old French term, and that means you're in sort of the middle. You're the artisans and the upper class people and the lower class people. You're sort of in the middle. You're the people that do the artisan work and things like that. In order to gentrify an area, you must destroy the area. And the tools for gentrification, I'm going to go through and as follow. Redlining. Redlining is where areas are restricted from loans, they're restricted from any type of investment, and the result of that brings reduction of services, reduction of education, just development goes away, even social issues. You know, people move away, it's not the same neighborhood. There's also things from that result in food and pharmacy deserts result when you do redlining. Restrictive covenants is another tool that's used in gentrification. Now, you can even see today in some titles that exist in America, it has restrictive covenants in them. Some of the titles still do, although they're not enforceable. What a restricted covenant is when you are told in your lease or your title that you can only sell the property to, well, actually, who tells you who you cannot sell the property to, and that at times were black people and Hispanics and some Asian people as well. Blockbusting is another tool which is used in gentrification. For example, there's been cases where what a realtor would do was he would pay someone, a black lady, to wheel a baby carriage in a white neighborhood, or to call up one of the residents of the neighborhood and ask for a black name. That was one way that they started to get blockbusting, and white people started to move away from the communities. The result of all that is obviously a rise in crime, lack of public works we talked about, and there's something called the rent gap theory. So at some point in time, it really doesn't make sense for the landlord to keep the property because the taxes are too high. Then you've got developers, you've got slum clearance, urban renewal, and there are plenty of tools which they can use to gentrify. Let's talk a little bit about the history of Atlanta. Atlanta was founded in 1847. It was a small community. In 1850, it was a community of only 3,000 people, in which 500 were slaves. By 1860, it was 10,000 and 4.5. Half of them were roughly slaves. Atlanta was a hub prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, but there was always a housing shortage that occurred. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I have to take you back, and so you can understand what it was like working during the period of 1860. Remember, there was no lights. People feared the dark. What happened were the locations where people lived was usually in walking distance from their jobs. Okay, that's important to know. We're going to go through that a little bit later in case. In 1862, There was the Land Grant Act, which gave people the opportunity to move west, nurture a land, and be able to get that land. Precluded from that were black people. I've seen cases where Asians were not able to take advantage of that. So that's something common. We were talking about 160 acres. If you maintain for 5 years, you would get that. Also, another act was the Mall Act, and the Mall Act built schools in the West, which attracted people to go out west. Plessy Ferguson came along, and the reason why I mention that is because that's sort of the backbone of separate but equal. And that Plessy Ferguson occurred in 1896. And what that did was that gave, by the Supreme Court, the right for you to give someone what would be separate but equal. And we know all about that. In 1906, there was a riot in Atlanta. There were 25 to 40 black people who were dead. 4 whites were dead. It was because of job competition, the tension from Reconstruction, voting rights and civil rights became an issue there. The Great Migration, the first Great Migration, 10% of the black people in the Great Migration came off the farms and they went to the city of Atlanta to work in the city of Atlanta. And skipping now to 1934, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, invoked the Federal Housing Authority Act, which was the first time bought people mortgages, 30-year mortgages, lower down payments. Again, a lot of all black people and other ethnic groups were denied that opportunity. Now, we talked about walk to work. I'm going to talk a little bit about a community called Techwood. Techwood was a community that existed in the early part of the 20th century. And in Techwood, it was about 30% black. And the people there, and I said walk to work, there was 30% black, yet the blacks and whites lived relatively pretty well. There weren't many issues there. The major company was the Coca-Cola Company, and people walked to work in 1935. In 1935, another event happened. Techwood became the first housing development in the United States that was built by the funds from the Great Depression that FDR had accumulated. The interesting thing with Techwood is that when they removed the people to build this complex, the complex was built and was an all-white complex. So all those black people that lived there before were removed. Right now, I should say that eventually became a site for the Olympics for Atlanta. And moving on to the GI Bill in 1957, President Eisenhower invoked the National Defense and Highway Act. It was 40,000 miles of roads. The impact of that on communities was dramatic. That was the beginning of the white flight. Another interesting fact in Atlanta, little known, is something called the Atlanta-Berlin Wall. What that was there was a doctor named Dr. Clinton Warner that moved into a white neighborhood. Once he moved into the neighborhood, an issue became with the mayor. And with the mayor, he built a wall separating the black community from the white community in Atlanta. The wall was built by black workers. That separated the communities in Atlanta. So Now we're going to, you can see the white flight begins. We get up to the 1970s where the urban blight begins. And we're going to talk about just one location here called Inman Park, which was one of Atlanta's first suburbs that eventually I-485, I believe, was built through, totally destroyed the area. Now if you went there, it's totally gentrified. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Please give me a thumbs up. If you're following me on Facebook, give me a follow. If you're following me on YouTube, subscribe, and have a great day. Thank you very much for your time.